Hello and welcome to HEARTspeak for Beginners. My name is Dr. Kenya Johnson, and I am one of the co-founders and co-owners of Full Circle Strategies. We are a consulting firm that works with organizations who are committed to starting and continuing their anti-racist journey. If you are watching this video, it is because you are participating in part of your onboarding experience. So welcome to America Votes. I'm excited for you because I know that you will be doing good work in this organization. We worked with America Votes for approximately 4 years. And so one of the things that we agreed to do was to continue to provide support with resources in these recorded Zoom sessions for HEARTspeak for Beginners. So I want to just kind of walk through that. There'll be 3 sessions altogether that you will watch. So the HEARTspeak roadmap consists of us talking about the facilitators of change, the racial justice framework and the 3 expressions of racism, and then an orientation to power. At the end of each recording, we'll close out with next steps. And so there may be different things that you will need to do, and you'll have access to the resources so that you can do it. So for this recording, our objectives are to identify, assess, and practice the facilitators of change in their work, recognize barriers and facilitators to organizational change, and understand how to engage in growth work through their HEARTspeak journey. And so this is a series of onboarding sessions. I'm not sure, how folks are being asked to budget their time, but just to give you a heads up, this recording is about an hour. They're all about an hour. The growth work is maybe about 25 minutes. So that just gives you a sense of how you can sort of plan your time to complete this part of your onboarding experience with America Votes. So the first thing I want to do is introduce our racial justice framework. In the second session, we'll go more in depth around what the racial justice framework entails, but just so you have some context. This work that we have been doing began in 2017, but for me personally, I started doing anti-racism training in about 2005. And at that time, I worked with an organization based out of Portland, Oregon called Western State Center, and then another organization based out of Chicago called Race Forward. So you may have heard of one or both of those. But in that work, I learned how to do this, and I received a lot of intensive training. And so some of what we talk about is due to the knowledge and the shoulders on which I stand. So I just want to make sure I am very clear and transparent. Like, we didn't invent a racial justice framework. We are borrowing from research, lived experiences, and countless of data and observations we have made as racial justice advocates. So there are 3 levels to the racial justice framework. First, it is to authentically acknowledge and really have a good understanding of our racialized history in the United States and to a lesser extent globally. And so when you think about authentic acknowledgement, it is consistent with reading and learning, right? Because what we don't want to do is start this journey without having information that helps us better understand our country's history, right? And so we know that the majority of us, the vast majority of us, were raised in public education spaces that did not honor the history adequately, right? And there were lots of pieces left out and lots of context missing, right? And so we may have only focused on a few things. And so having that recognition is important because here with the racial justice framework, there is this commitment to learning more. And so some of you through your college experience or graduate school experience, or just as you're getting older and wanting to learn more about your world, you may have begun to start reading books that have opened your eyes. And if that is the case, that is awesome. If you are still trying to figure out, like, okay, how do I learn about this, and what do I need to know, you'll be provided with resources, right? And so another thing that we want to provide folks is a toolkit, and it kind of gives you a starting reader list, for things to lean into. Critical or critically analyze is the other layer of the framework. And so this is really important, and is central to how we frame racial justice in the context of one's work, right? And so with the critical analysis, this gives us the opportunity to not just know how things happen or know the history of how things happen, but to understand and recognize when we're seeing examples of systemic racism, when we're seeing examples of implicit bias, when we're seeing examples of white supremacy, when we're seeing examples of xenophobia or, you know, uh, homophobia. And so this is really getting at the heart of how do these things show up in a workplace? What typically happens, and what do I need to understand about that? And where do I need to challenge myself so that I am not complicit or passive to when I see these things, and B, am able to speak truth to power and address it. And so things you want to think about are the use of tokenism, and how internalized oppression impacts us, which again in session 2 we'll talk a lot about, and more importantly, the way in which silence is used, as a weapon to avoid having conversations about oppression and ways in which we can engage in oppression work in our jobs. The last level is holistically liberate. So one of the parts about the way we approach our work at Full Circle is to see it not just as a way to teach people new information and call out racism, but to really think about how do we learn behaviors that require us or motivate us to create a healthy workplace, to create healthy relationships, to thrive in ways that we may have not done before in the past. And so holistic liberation is about the teachings and the implementation of formal and informal practices that take care of us and take care of each other at work. And so that goes all the way from specific things like, are people getting paid equitably? Do people have time off? Do people feel bad for taking time off? All the way to, are we providing mental health supports? Are we recognizing when what's happening in our communities and in our world is taking a toll on our employees, and we're pausing the work, or we're honoring that, right? And so that's the holistic, liberation piece. Are we also welcoming people in their spiritual practices in the way that they find their hope and find their joy, to do their work, to do the good work? And so, how do we make space for all of those things? So, this is the racial justice framework. For the subsequent sessions, I will do my spiel again and introduce it, so that it starts to stick for folks. If we were in a session and, you were joining me and we were actively participating either virtually or by Zoom, this will be really, really important for how we hold the space. But this is still something, that you can apply to your, racial justice toolkit, right? These will still be skills that you can utilize and lean on. And in parts of the organization at America Votes, for those who have been around long enough to have done the HEARTspeak journey for multiple years, many of them have internalized the community agreements and, try to apply them and use them in their daily life and in the workspace. So I want to walk through all 10 so you can see why I'm really harping on these being skills and these being something that you can use outside of a training space. So the first is to engage in active and deep listening. That is critical for how we practice anti-racism. Oftentimes we already come into conversations and spaces with judgments, preconceived notions, assumptions, stories, past hurt and harm. And so when those things are like surfacing and the minutia of those things are clouding our thoughts, it's hard for us to actively listen. And so we really name that is the first behavioral practice that is going to help you start to make that shift. Am I really leaned in and actively listening, right? Or am I thinking about what I'm going to say next? Or am I reacting physically to what I'm hearing? Am I upset? What is happening, right? And so how do I practice active and deep listening when I'm in conversation with my colleagues, when I'm in conversations with folks in the community, when I am speaking at meetings with external partners about priorities or they're sharing their thoughts? How do I engage in active and deep listening? The second agreement is to understand the value of discomfort and pay attention to feelings of defensiveness. With heart work, and we do consider this to be heart work, um, it is about getting in touch with where you may be challenged to lean into an anti-racism journey, right? And I say anti-racism because that is the foundation of what we do. But please understand, this is about anti-oppression work. It is about the intersectionality of our lived experiences and lived identities. So that being said, depending on how you show up in the world is going to dictate where you find comfort and where you experience discomfort, where you might be defensive or where you might lean in. And so it's going to be on you to have to start to practice some self-awareness, right? And so if you're sitting in a meeting and folks are talking about, I don't know, a strategy for how they engage with a community who in the last election cycle was kind of standoffish or kind of hesitant with America Votes Table or with some other coalition, right? If that is surfacing um, and people are sharing their experiences, you may experience discomfort and defensiveness if what you're hearing is counter to what you may have experienced, right? Or people may be sharing a story about a moment when they felt harmed or they felt disrespected or something that they just don't like that goes on in the workplace. It may not be something that bothers you, but it bothers them. And you may experience discomfort just in having to sit with the fact that someone is experiencing something that is different from you. And you don't understand why it's such a big deal, right? And so those are different examples of how you begin to think about discomfort and defensiveness. The ability to pay attention to it and lean into it and get curious and go within and sort of start asking yourself questions is the skill, right? And so this isn't about eliminating discomfort or getting rid of discomfort because that's not natural. We're human. We're going to respond and react to external stimuli in all the ways, including tension and conflict. The skill is learning what to do with it, learning how to move with it, learning how to sit with it. I think in the type of work that happens at America Votes and in other types of civic engagement and political organizing work, there is this underlining rush of urgency to move and get things done. Um, and what you will hear throughout the HeartSpeak recordings is urgency is not always the best approach. And even when it comes to your own discomfort, right? Think about when you've been upset with your partner or your spouse or a family member or a close friend. Most of us don't like that feeling. Like we want to get past it. Okay, all right. What do you want for dinner? Right. And we change the subject to try to like mend the fences and move forward with being back connected in a relationship. But sometimes it requires us to sit in the discomfort and hopefully that experience may reveal something that will help enhance how we show up for each other. Take on a growth mindset. Um, I hope that as you learned about America Vote's commitment to anti-racism and how they have infused it into their work very comprehensively, hopefully that did not intimidate you. Hopefully that made you feel like, oh man, this is a really great organization. I'm glad I'm working here, right? And I bring that up because a growth mindset often comes up when we feel self-conscious, when we feel defeated, when we feel hopeless, when we feel incompetent. And so even though you were hired to do a specific thing, we also believe that everybody, whether they're in accounting, on IT, um, community facing work, um, whatever, right? Everybody should have access to and understand what it looks like to be a part of a healthy workplace. This may also mean we have to learn new skills, and that is okay. And so at no point should you feel, okay, I'm not as smart as I thought I was, or I don't know all the things, because this isn't about your scholastic or academic or professional skills by trade. This is about building competency so that you're able to have conversations and able to solve problems and able to move forward. And so sometimes what we have to do when we experience the gap, right? The knowledge gap is take on a growth mindset. Okay, I may not know this, but I know who I can go to for help. Or this feels weird, but I know that if I sit in the discomfort and think about this, I can reflect and maybe come at it with fresh eyes in a day, right? And so growth mindset is that pivot, that shift, and that normalcy, normalizing that this work is very iterative and very messy and can be challenging, but it can also be rewarding. Bring a commitment to curiosity. A huge characteristic of anti racism work is leaning into curiosity, right? Leaning into curiosity, once you really develop that as a skill, as a strategy for how you engage with people, it will help you pause, which is the next community agreement, right? And so bringing a commitment to curiosity is one way, one intervention to manage implicit bias. So if you want to practice bias reduction and harm reduction, part of that comes with getting curious about the engagement. Who is this person that you're speaking with? What is this conversation? And what do you need to learn from them? What can you share with them, and um, what can they share with you, right? So getting curious about your own relationship, the way that you show up in different spaces, work or otherwise. Practicing lean in or wait, I will say really try to take on this skill on your teams, right? And I'm not sure, some of you who are very comfortable extroverts or been in your careers for a while, it may be easy for you to participate and lean in. And so that's great. But if you're still kind of early in your career and you're just trying to find your voice and try to find your place in discussions, whether they be about race, gender, the work, politics, this agreement encourages you to lean in, right? And use the growth mindset mantra to lean in and lend your voice to the conversation, lend your voice to the space, right? That's another way in which we learn from each other and in which we become challenged. The objective is that we are challenged, right? And not like moving around as one unit, one monolith, with everybody thinking the same, everybody approaching the work the same. That's unrealistic. And so, how do we honor the diversity of thought, the diversity of experience, the diversity of cultures? We speak our truth, and we learn from the truth that we hear others speak. Alternatively, the acronym WAIT is something that is also a skill around connection, but it comes at it from a different angle. WAIT stands for why am I talking? And that is you using boundaries in moments where dialogue is happening. And so here's what I mean. Sometimes we speak up because we're nervous. Sometimes we speak up because we are uncomfortable and we got offended. And so we're ready with a rebuttal. Sometimes we speak up because nobody else is talking and it's silent and that makes you feel uncomfortable and you want to break the ice and you just want to get past it. So you say something or you tell a joke, right? And those have been sort of go-to behaviors of human interaction. Like you've seen it, we've all done it. But you're gonna have to practice the analysis, the self-analysis of why am I talking? What is motivating me to say this thing right now? Do I need to say it? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes the answer might be something's coming up and I really just want to say it, but I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna wait and see what other people have to say. I'm gonna journal. I'm gonna give myself time to think about this because I know I need time to process, or my emotions are all over the place. I do feel some tension in my shoulders. My palms are sweaty. My ears are hot. I feel like I'm upset and agitated. And either I'm going to say something and speak my truth, or I'm going to recognize that my body is activated and I'm going to give myself space to calm down. There is no right or wrong way. What I'm encouraging you to do is be self aware so that you can show up in the best way possible. Honor confidentiality. As you engage in candid conversations about your lived experience and hear people share their lived experiences and however setting is set up for you, you want to honor that, right? And you don't want to violate someone's trust by repeating their story, right? The best thing I also teach, and what I usually tell my students is what you should get comfortable sharing is your key learnings. What did you learn from the exchange with whomever? What was your takeaway? What really impacted you without like telling details that are meant for that person to tell? Commit to staying present. Again, this is not a live interactive training session. And so the context around staying present usually has to do with being in the moment. But there's another way to think about commit to staying present. The idea that, and it's similar to the growth mindset, the idea that we try to meet each new opportunity with a fresh set of eyes, right? So, and this is hard, particularly for people who have lived their life on the margins, people who have experienced oppression, people who have been misunderstood because they may show up differently in terms of how they learn. It may be neurodivergent or show up differently in terms of how they understand religion, like all the different things, right? And so usually when that happens, we kind of want to protect ourselves and we don't want to get hurt. And I get that. But we are going to have to figure out like how do we take risks, which is the next agreement. How do we take risks and stay present, which can be being vulnerable, right? I'm gonna let go of what happened to me at my last job, and I'm gonna meet this person where they are, or um, I'm going to not think about the what my implicit biases are trying to tell me to do, because implicit biases are like these design patterns of thinking in our brains. Like we can't necessarily control them, but we can acknowledge them. So when those thoughts start to creep up, instead of judging yourself, go, oh, I'm thinking, okay, I'm having a thought and I don't know what's up with that, but let me focus and let me try to stay present. And then let me later maybe get curious, like, why did my mind go there? And then also give myself grace. So commit to being vulnerable and taking risks is a part of the anti-racism journey. I think for most of us, we usually find ourselves in spaces where we're talking about race relationships and people are usually quiet, and I get that. And so part of getting to a place where there is trust and there is a healthy dose of tension, but also support, people are willing to take risks and they're willing to be vulnerable. Engage with a sense of urgency versus purpose, particularly for the onboarding. I don't know if you're watching this. You may be watching this right as you started working, or this may be something that you still needed to cross off your to-do list. So you want to get through it, and I get that. But really think about the idea of moving with purpose versus urgency, even outside of the context of this training, right? When we move with urgency, and that becomes our default way to show up in the world, we run the risk of hurting people unintentionally, right? And so urgency does not mean things aren't prioritized. Urgency does not mean that things aren't important or significant or the gravity of the situation isn't being felt. But what it is encouraging us to do is think purposefully. What is needed most in this moment? How can I best show up? How can we really think about this strategy? Do we have all the voices? Do we have all the people? Are we thinking about all the perspectives? And if the answer is no to any of those, then we may need to pivot. We may need to pause. We may need to slow down long enough to collect the data, collect the perspectives, collect the experiences that we need to make informed and healthy choices about how we do this work. Lastly, and probably most importantly, uh, seek out and identify your systems of support. Being on an anti-racism journey is not for the faint of heart. Um, so many things can happen. If you don't have someone that you can check in with and talk to help you hold yourself accountable and have support, you'll kind of start to step away from it, and you may not prioritize it like you do other things, right? And so having that support and having a space where you can talk and get feedback helps you stay the course of your journey. Also, what what we have learned after years of doing this and working with so many organizations, so many people who represent boomer generation, millennials, Gen Z, Gen X, like me, people come into diverse spaces ready to talk, but often don't realize that sometimes the conversations may surface traumatic experiences. Um, Sometimes the conversations may just weigh heavy on you, on your body. Usually, when we're doing live trainings at the end, we are very cognizant about telling people fuel up, drinks, hydrate, eat a nourishing meal, take a walk, go do something that is causes you not to be on the screen or on your phone, because this is body work too. And so I really want you to think about how you take care of yourself, and how you lean into support. Okay, so that was a long-winded version of the agreements. In the next two sessions, I'll just kind of go through it quickly. But you'll have access to these things outside of the Zoom recording. The theory in which we have built HEARTspeak is race equity work. And so this theory says that this theory is about how we do race equity in the workplace. So it's specific to that. And so this theory is the foundation to how people contribute in their workplace. And so efforts that contribute to a high sense of value, trust, support, and connection felt by all members of an organization, regardless of their perceived racial, ethnic, or forms of identity. Practices can include creating space for engaging in difficult dialogue, confronting bias and harm, collecting data, learning from data, um, facilitating professional development, coaching individuals on how to build relationships. So a lot of the things that I touched on, and I'll keep repeating certain phrases and certain things. I think one, it's good to hear things repeated. Two, it helps you build the muscle. It helps you start to internalize it. And pretty soon you hopefully will be using the terminology. So your anti-racist journey is about navigating new behaviors. And so right now, all of y'all are in your comfort zone, right? Where there is familiarity, certainty, and security, right? And again, like I referenced, we get hired in these positions because we're good at what we do. We have a resume looks good. People want to invest in us, and we're going to contribute to doing great work. And that feels good. When you, however, when you start to get challenged or when you're asked to take on a commitment or a responsibility that pushes you out of your comfort zone, things happen, which is why we include that support in there. You're going to be navigating new behaviors. Depending on where in the organization you are doing the work, will sort of dictate how much time you spend talking about race equity or anti racism or anti oppression. It may vary from one part of the year to the next, right? So I'm not really sure the way you will like really lean in and engage into it. But in the event that you do, think about it this way. You want to get to a place where you're learning and growing. And in order to get to a place where you're learning and growing, you're going to have to be in spaces and be in conversations where you feel that fear, right? And that fear really, it's not about you being harmed or someone trying to like force you to do anything. It's about you taking on skills that are new, you being okay with messing up, you being okay with asking for help, right? You're not feeling confident, but you do it anyway, right? I don't usually use I statements, but I'm going to try to use I statements when I talk to my colleague, right? Or when I talk to this community member, or when I talk to my significant other, right? And so it is normal to experience fear, trepidation. Um, what's another one? Anxiety um, when doing this work. Those are normal. This work is messy, and the more intense it is, the more you will experience that, right? And so I just want to make sure you have that awareness and you understand, like even as you look at this chart, that it is about learning and growing, right? The panic zone is representative of moments where organizations do not take the time to practice intentionality and be deliberate about how they support their teams. And so right now, the very fact that you're doing a HEARTspeak for Beginners training is a testament of America's vote intentionality with this, right? And so instead of just throwing you in there and you do something or you say a one-off and like, hey, don't you know we're anti-racist? You can't be talking like that. Like that shouldn't happen. It should be more, hey, we all started at the beginning and we're all at different places on our journey. And we're also all here to help support each other. We don't want people to panic. We don't want people to give up. We want people to take on the growth mindset and see this challenge as a way for them to grow and just be better at what you do, right? Okay. So today's topic is about the facilitators of change, and it's our foundation to HEARTspeak. These are the four drivers of anti-racist change. And so think of it this way. Um, People often talk about being committed to ending systemic oppression, being committed to being anti-racist, not, being subjected to implicit bias. Like we talk about the things that we believe in, but we rarely talk about the behaviors and the practices that help us honor those beliefs. So I can say I'm anti-racist, which, by the way, it is not necessarily. It's not necessarily that a person is anti-racist. It is a person practicing anti-racism. So we want you to think of it as a behavioral shift, not a title, right, or a destination, right? We don't do this work and then become anti-racist. we commit to the journey and we allow the journey to carry us and we just keep doing the work. And even if we pause or get tired, we rest and we return to the work. And so there are four drivers that we really believe are substantial in helping organizations scale up so that their workplace culture can center race equity, right? And so those four drivers are holistic wellness, authentic connections, shifting power, and cultural humility. So let's start with wellness. Wellness is about creating formal and informal systems of support that respond to people's social emotional needs. Particular attention is made to engaging in restorative practices and creating space for liberation. So, liberation and restoration are two new things that aren't typically talked about in a workplace. Usually, in a workplace, HR or people, people business partners, or I'm trying to think of all the names, people who are responsible for making sure you know what policies are, making sure you know how to advance, making sure you have your salary, making sure you have all the things. Those would be the people who are also responsible for building culture. And typically or historically, that has looked like, providing trainings on sexual harassment, providing trainings on, discrimination, um, providing trainings on Excel, so all the professional development type of things, right? What we have not done and what we're now trying to get organizations to center is creating space where people can resolve conflict, right? Um, at best, some organizations will put mediation practices in place, but most don't. It usually doesn't surface until something bad happens. And then folks are like, oh, okay, we need to do mediation. Oh, what we're going to do? Well, put them on a performance evaluate, what they call it, PIP, performance something plan. Um, let's figure out how we're going to do this. And there are legal pathways to dealing with noncompliance and insubordination. But what about when there is conflict within the organization on a team between a manager and another manager, or between two peers who are on the same level, or or what have you? How do we acknowledge that and rebuild the relationship? How do we work through that? How do we repair that? That's a restorative practice. And so thinking about like what does happen in my workplace when there's conflict? How do we work through it? Ideally, each manager would have some sort of plan that is a reflection of their training, but also their commitment to making sure their team is functioning properly, right? The high functioning team. And so maybe they're like, at the beginning of each meeting, we talk about this, or I remind them, or I do weekly check-ins with each person. So I give them the time and the space, and the protected space to talk about what's coming up. I encourage discourse between my team members, right? I'm not the only voice. And so I try to encourage them to lean in and share their ideas, but also surface where they feel challenged. And so that's usually a manager's role. But again, if it's not mandated and not built into the culture, it will depend on how comfortable people feel doing that. Liberation is the other piece about holistic wellness, and it is defined by the individual, right? We want people to feel liberated in what they do and in who they are. So we don't have a script for liberation. Like it would be anti-liberation of me to say liberation means this. There are some generalized characteristics of what it means to feel liberated, but ultimately it's going to come down to that individual person. And so if um, for me, that means showing up in a certain way and I convey that to my colleagues and my superiors, and they honor that, a part of that is my liberating experience, right? And this comes from the notion that in many workplace spaces, the bottom line is conformity and assimilation. We expect people to conform to the way we work and the way we do things. And that is not realistic. We're different, right? I think there can be some expectations that are based on your job description and the ultimate goal of what we do in community. But the way in which we do it and the way in which we bring our lived experience should be honored. And that's a form of liberation. Building authentic connections is the second driver of change. And so being committed to the idea of not just knowing the people that you work with, but having a relationship with them. Not to be conflated or confused with being best friends or, getting romantically involved. That is not what authentic connections are. Authentic connections can be and should be relationships in which you can develop enough familiarity with the person to be able to do good work together and speak your truth and manage the conflict. Oftentimes, conflict blows up and it gets to a level of harm or sometimes even egregious harm because we haven't done the pre-work of like, how do we just establish our connection to each other? At HeartSpeak, we talk about relationships in terms of connections and disconnections, right? But connection is about personal storytelling and sharing, right? Um, Deep and reflective listening, so that you can start to build mutual empathy for one another. If you're not sharing and you're being closed off, and you are the type where you're like, this is just a job to me, I just show up and work, I don't talk to anybody, that's going to be problematic to building authentic connections. And I also know that usually when people say that, it is because they don't have trust in the dynamic. Something has happened where they feel like, I'm not saying anything, right? And so if you're a manager, that's something to pay attention to. If you're not a manager, that's something to talk about, right? And so, how do we get to a place where there is mutual empathy? I hear you, I see you, I understand you, and I can support you. I can also set boundaries. I can also say the thing that may be hard to say, right? Um, that's how we build authentic connections. In the workplace, we want those authentic connections to get to a place where we experience relational trust, right? And again, you know, I've been in previous workshops and in learning spaces where we talk about trust, or we do the trust fall, and it always has been like this sort of abstract thing, like a feeling that you have, like, I don't know if I trust you, right? Or where it's easier for us to name when we don't trust something because we know the thing that caused the distrust, right? And so the connections that I'm introducing hopefully can give you some concrete examples of what trust should look like in a workplace space. But before that, let's just kind of go through it. Relational trust thrives when there is a collective effort to effectively engage in difficult dialogue, identify solution focused strategies, and incorporate efforts of appreciation that help individuals feel a sense of belonging to the organization and the work itself. So that's the broad definition of relational trust. So now I'm going to go to this next slide, which are the authentic connection outputs. So what should that look like? What does relationship or relational trust look like? So this is an opportunity to pause and reflect. And so while we can't speak to each other, this is a good place to pause and look at the screen and look at these and think about your connection to each one of them. Are you experiencing this? Um, are you helping others experience this? Like, what does this look like? How does this happen? Right. And you can do it in the context of where you specifically work at America Boats, because then you know what that looks like, right? And so the connection output includes having a sense of value. I matter, right? Nobody wants to work at a place where they don't feel valued. Why would you want to work there? Further, if you had to work there because you needed the money, but you don't feel valued, think about how you show up. Trust. I can be vulnerable. Remember, I was talking about like I'm not having a conversation. I'm gonna keep my mouth shut because I don't want the repercussions, or I don't want someone telling my business, and so that's real, right? So building trust requires vulnerability. And so how are we creating an environment where people can feel vulnerable, right? And people can trust that they can say what they need to say without being retaliated against, or being looked at differently, or being other, right? That's a hard one, because for that, that's going to take the work of everybody. And if there have been past harms or past experiences, either in the organization or from the last organization, we have to we have to be patient and give grace to that too, right? Peace, I am where I need to be. The feeling that, okay, I'm this is home. This is where I'm working for right now. Investment, I want to see this through, right? And so there's a commitment and a level of motivation um, to do the work you were hired to do because you're invested, right? It's important to you. Validation, my contribution is needed. How do we convey validation to people? What is it that we say? How is it that we respond, right? And so some of these outputs may require us to think about skills we need to demonstrate that. How do we demonstrate that? So I could say, for example, good job, Matt, on the project. That may feel validating. I'm not gonna knock it. Um, saying good job. But if I wanted to be more effective and really, convey this sense of that I trust you to do the work, that I value your work, and that I validate what you do at this organization, I may say something like, Matthew, if you just have a moment, I just want to say it it really is super helpful every time you're such detailed in your reports, and the way that you point to different things that you want me to review and look at, the way that you give me time. Like when you do those things, that is so helpful, and it allows me to do my part more efficiently. So thank you for that. And so you're being behavioral specific. So you're not saying good job. You're saying this is what you did that really is working well and is really a great contribution, right? Or maybe it's more, again, like your insight and your strategy and the way that you thought about that, the way that you showed up in the meeting and provided feedback to Sam when they were confused about what to do. You did it with care. You convey empathy, and I think that helps the team, right? And so being behavioral specific can help get to validation. Support, I can get the help I need. Of course, we talked about that. And then love, I feel connected to others. So again, pause and reflect. Think about, where does this come up? Where do these come up? Or do you experience these? Have you experienced them in other workplaces? How does it feel? What do you need? These are things that you should be reflecting on. And perhaps you can talk about with your manager, or you can talk about in other spaces where you all are engaging in dialogue. So, love was the last connection output. And I wanted to pause just to like really talk through this, because sometimes when I'm working with organizational teams and they see that, they kind of like flinch a little bit. But what's interesting is, as of late, like since Trump won 2024, I think all through 2025, people have been nodding their head. So it's interesting the way that it went from what you mean talk about love in the workplace or love our coworkers to like, oh God, we need more love. And so that tells me that that more people are thinking about love as a source of power, right? And so this is not about romantic love. This is not about familial love. Like, again, don't have to be best friends, don't have to fall in love, don't have to take them out to dinner, don't have to buy them their kids' birthday presents. That's not what we're saying. What this is about how can we use love as a source of power to do the collective work? And in this, love is not just a feeling, it's not just a way that you feel, it's a way that you act, a way that you show up for each other, right? And again, these connection outputs um, can be applied outside the context of work. It could be applied to your faith groups and faith communities, um, school community, your family, and any other, maybe movement building work, a space you may be occupying. Some best practices for building authentic connections include taking on a growth mindset. Again, I'm repeating a lot of the community agreements. So it's like wash, rinse, repeat, wash, rinse, repeat. So take on a growth mindset. Get curious, seek out opportunities to learn more information. Use the shared language in community agreements in your toolkit. Learn how to sit in discomfort, right? Because sometimes the connection, the authentic connection, could be right around the corner, just beyond the discomfort. And think about relationships where at one point you weren't sure, are we friends? Are we cool? And you go through that discomfort and you go through that tension. And then on the other side, there's more clarity, there's more trust. So think about sitting in discomfort with the idea that there could be possible outcomes of joy and connection. Model vulnerability and ask for support. The third facilitator of change is shifting and building power. This is leveraging how we use our assumed and perceived privileges to change current systems within the organization. Uh, The first bullet is very, very important. This is probably one of the facilitators of change where we do specifically talk about white supremacy. We talk about the cultural whiteness because power um, in its relationship to anti-racism is really, really, really important. Because I can be nice or I can be benevolent. I can befriend you. I can hire you. I could work with you on a project, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm willing to share power. That doesn't necessarily mean I can recognize the power that you bring to the space. And that that's the work, right? The power is how we win elections, change leadership, um, see people, hear them, right, and honor their stories and their experiences. That's power, right? And so I can say, I'm a really good person and I do good things and I have a diverse friend group and all the things, right? Whether you're a person of color or a white person, you could say those things. Um, but I'm also going to ask you to think about how you use your positional power and your assumed privileges to make the shifts that are necessary, right? And so that means you may be in a position where you have access to resources. When we have access to resource, we have options. We can share resources or we can hoard resources. We can come up with excuses for why we don't share resources. Oh, but I don't know if they quite understand the program or the framework, and their reports are, not completely, they're not comprehensive reports. So it's hard to tell, like, if the work is getting done. Like, I hear these things all the time. And again, A person who has power and privilege often sits in a position of judgment and can determine whether or not you add value. That's powerful. So think about how you show up. Think about your positionality. Think about your privileges, right? Are you hoarding resources? Is the organization hoarding resources? Are you thinking about communities using a deficit center lens, right? Deficit center means that you don't see their strengths, you don't see their power, you see their inadequacies, you see the gaps, you see what they don't do well, right? And then that becomes the place in which you try to intervene, right? Or you gatekeep, right? And gatekeeping happens a lot in civic engagement and political organizing work, right? Using the same communications consultant all the time, or using people that we have relationships with versus trying to open it up to have more diverse voices and experiences contribute to the overall strategy of the work, right? The last one is embracing a culture of humility, using a critical self-reflection to shift our thinking away from cultural competency and towards lifelong learning. Um, This is probably my favorite because I feel like I am constantly challenged around wellness and authentic connections and shifting power. But cultural humility has truly become a lifelong journey for me. It has really changed the way I see people, the way I see myself. Um, it started with me learning how to give grace because I'm a perfectionist. I like things done a certain way. I do. I also, being a college professor, I tend to gravitate towards students who remind me of myself, right? Um, which is not fair, right? Because I had to learn how to get to this level of who I am. And so, me like looking at them because they don't speak up enough in class or they seem shy or intimidated, it wouldn't be fair for me to like overlook them or not consider that they have something valid to contribute, right? And so cultural humility teaches us to pause and recognize that we're not perfect and we all make mistakes. And it and it and that we have to live in curiosity um, to do this. The tenets are here, which overlap again with the community agreements. So you saw one already. Understanding that we're not perfect, we will all make mistakes. Understanding that this work is about all of our liberation. And I think that's another thing that has come up historically in community work and movement building work is oftentimes people with the resources and with the power and with the access to power or leaders in charge, they often feel like they're saving a community versus they're joining and collaborating with the community because this is about all of us. Again, now that we're in Trump 2.0, 2025, whatever this is, the feeling I get when I talk to different people across different sectors is many folks are starting to lean into this idea of collective liberation, right? And so that feels hopeful to me. But from an anti racist perspective, we have to understand that we're no better than the person next to us, right? Leaning into critical self reflection and challenge our personal motives, shifting how we see and leverage power to forge paths that allow historically marginalized communities to center their voices and lived experience, and then taking on a growth mindset and committing to doing better. So, those are the tenets of cultural humility. Um, I try to live by these, I try to model these, I try to acknowledge it when I see it. Sometimes in a training or a meeting or in a classroom, someone may exhibit that, and I put a name to it, right? When you do that, you reinforce the behavior. So when you're able to say, hey, I really like that you took on a growth mindset, the person who receives that appreciates that and they do it again. So, how this looks, the foundation to being on an anti racism journey are the four drivers: cultural humility, holistic wellness, authentic connections, building and shifting power. That's the foundation. So, those are the four things that you should be cementing into your brain around. Okay, each time I'm confronted with a problem, a challenge, I really need to think about, like, holistically, from a wellness perspective, what is needed. From a relationship perspective, what is needed. Have we addressed the power, right? And how am I leaning into cultural humility to give this grace and the time it needs, right? And then you have the community agreements, right? That's helping you build your muscle. Those are the your go-to everyday skills to kind of help you really show up in a way that's authentic. The last thing I'll cover are barriers to heart speak. So just like we covered the drivers, um, there are things that get in the way. And so these are things that we know have already been happening historically in our institutions. These are things that we have seen. And so depending on how long you've been in the workplace, you may have seen some of these in other jobs that you've had. So again, I talked about the sense of urgency, but that is a barrier. That's a barrier to the work. A sense of urgency is this idea that you don't have time to listen to other voices. You don't have time to slowing this down because we got to hurry up and do the work or else. And usually, when you're moving at a sense of urgency, um, when you start to ask rapid fire questions. Okay, it's like, what's going on? Why are other questions? What's coming up for you? Urgency can also manifest as I'm losing my train of thought, which is not good on a recorded session. I just thought about it. Um, it'll come back to me. So moving with a sense of urgency can be a barrier to the work. And remember, if we move too fast, it could be harmful. It can be harmful. And I've seen that happen. I've seen it be harmful. Intellectualizing the work versus humanizing the work, right? And so usually intellectualizing happens when we fill out our comfort zone and like there's a knowledge gap around a conversation. And so what we do is tend to flex out and intellectualize to show that we're smart and we know what we're doing. And from a cultural humility standpoint, you don't need to flex. It's okay, right? It's okay that you don't know this. Intellectualizing also can be the discomfort, right? Sometimes when people are just uncomfortable having conversations about authentic connections and connection outputs because it's too emotional or too touchy feely, people will go and be very technical and intellectualize, right? Um, and then another reason that intellectualizes surface, or another example of how it surfaces, is when people are holding on to shame about their power and their privilege or how they show up. And so instead of leaning into that discomfort and getting curious about it and thinking about how they want to manage it, they deflect by intellectualizing. Opposite of that is humanizing. So we're people at the end of the day, right? And we all have a story. We all know what harm looks like. We know what it looks like to be disappointed. We know what it looks like to be um, overlooked. Um, and so, how do we hold conversations where we can surface those experiences and allow that to also contribute to the work and how we move forward with the work? Good bad binary is another barrier. So this comes from and her book is across my office. Um, the book White Fragility is listed on the toolkit, and I'm forgetting her name, the author's name, but she talks a lot about good bad binary, and it's not just for white folks. I think we all We all fall into it. We all have been trained to be perfect at what we do. We've all have been trained to move with urgency and to be productive. That is a core American efficiency and productivity is a core American value. And so when we don't do those things, we judge ourselves, right? And if we're judging ourselves, guess who else we're judging? Other people. So when you get caught up in a good bad binary, you shut down, right? If you're like, oh, I didn't get this right, or I'm not going to be able to do this. Like, that's just not my area of expertise. I just don't feel comfortable doing it, and then you shut down and back away from it. Instead of taking on a growth mindset. This, I'm out my territory here, but I'm going to trust and lean into this. Right. Or, okay, that person didn't get the report done in time. I'm not going to scapegoat and what's the word? Scapegoat, and it's another word. It's not criminalize. It's another word that means instead of looking at the behavior, you are now looking at the person and their character, and you're judging them. You're judging them wholly instead of judging the thing that didn't happen, right? And so whether they didn't say the right thing in a meeting, they didn't turn a report in on time, they didn't respond with the right decorum in an email, all the things, right? Instead of assigning a good bad binary to that person, a good bad binary of judgment, you extend grace, right? And you still see them as a whole person. You still value them as a whole person. And then you have the conversation that you need to have that's behavioral specific about the thing. Power hoarding, which I talked about, right? So keeping resources from organizations is a barrier to anti-racism, right? And it's probably one of the biggest barriers. That's why we're here, right? That's why we still say marginalized communities, underserved communities, that because they have not had the economic power, opportunity, political power, opportunity to thrive. So, last, pause and reflect. Which barriers do you recognize because you have either observed or perpetuated them? And are there barriers that are harder to recognize than others? And so that's something to think about, right? Because for some of you in the work that you do, you may go, oh, yeah, the sense of urgency, that comes up a lot. But that may not be a thing for others, right? And so think about which barriers you have to be mindful and pay attention to and decide how to use those facilitators of change to mitigate that. Next steps, you should have access to a cultural humility video and a video called Revolutionary Love. Watch both of those. They're incredibly helpful. It really gets you grounded in the idea of cultural humility, and revolutionary love really gives you a clear framework for how we do this work in uncertain times. Read the citizenship article. That's really about you seeing yourself as a citizen in your workplace community and not a consumer. You're not here to just like, okay, I'm gonna do my onboarding, I'll get signed my work, I'll get my laptop and I'll go do the thing. You have to actively participate in making sure you have a workplace culture that thrives and centers race equity. So that may just be one thing that you have to do. Somebody else may have a million things that they have to do, but everybody needs to be doing something. And it starts with showing up and reflecting those community agreements and centering those facilitators of anti-racist change. Review this again at your leisure. Um, you should have access to the slide deck. And then complete the self-reflection prompts that are listed here, right? And so these are things to think about. What might be most challenging for you as you begin your HEARTspeak journey, right? What does your panic zone look like? What barriers might exist or might you encounter in your work at AB? What is your geographical story, which you may or may not be prepared to reflect on now? It definitely is talked more about in the second session. And then after you watch Cultural Humility and Revolutionary Love, how do your personal experiences align with what you learn? Where are you getting curious? Okay. So I know that was a lot, and I don't know. I hope that was an hour. I don't even know. Um, gonna make sure I look at my clock for the next session, but you have access to this to watch as many times as you need. Um, and if you need to reach out to your HR team or your change team, as they have the resources that we've provided them with. Thank you for your commitment to this work and good luck with your new position.